Good morning. I want to thank you for joining us on this beautiful morning, especially for a Saturday. I really appreciate your time. I know how busy everyone is, and it's just an honor to get to talk with you today about something I'm really passionate about. So, my name's Stephanie Wilson. I'm a sports dietitian. I'm also an instructor for Isac Anthropometry. That's a level 3 certification, and I've been practicing in sports nutrition for the last 15 years. Most recently, I'm contracted to work with military, and I also have my own business teaching Isac for organizations and professionals. Part of why I'm so passionate about it is because of the growth I've seen with it in my practice and in the industry, really getting to provide better care for our players and athletes. So we're going to talk about that today, and I'll get started. And most recently, I was before working with my current roles, I was working with Major League Baseball in one of the teams as well. Okay, so let's explore how Isac can be used in baseball specifically, and some different considerations that you can take away. Okay, so what is Isac? I mean, everybody's talked about it. You know, we've had it at the MLB Combine last year, and we'll have it again this year. But what exactly is it? So this is a bone structure and body composition method that uses skin folds, bone breadths, limb lengths, and muscle girths to really fractionate the body into 5 different parts. So it's able to break the body into different segments, even more so than other body compositions. It is internationally used. It's only been used previously in the United States at the Olympic training centers up until about 2012-ish. After that, we really started picking up the exploring Isac in different ways to use it in the States. And part of that big difference is really because internationally it's been used because practitioners they don't have necessarily the access to quite as much technology. Whereas in the States, we had quite a big shift, being able to have bod pods and DEXAs and lots of technology to meet a need. And that's very precise and can be very easily repeated. Whereas internationally, they might not have had that access. So to continue to develop the skill set of the practitioner with skin fold, improving that technical error of measurement. So the Isac is a standardized approach. It is a controlled methodology that is used at the elite level and at the Olympic level to standardize the way we measure different body composition. So since there are so many different certifying methods out there, it can be difficult to make comparisons. It's nice to have one standard methodology from country to country, and we can better assure that the data isn't flawed. So how you're measuring someone, whether you're measuring their glutes, or like if they're standing shoulder width apart, are they further than shoulder width apart? Are their feet together? Those are going to change that actual measurement once it's completed. So the International Society for the Advancement of Anthropometry is what Isac stands for. And this is an international group who in the 1980s created a standardized approach. There are 2 different levels for standardization, which we'll talk through at the end. And you can really determine a lot of interesting variables through these different measurements. So as I mentioned, it is a standardized approach. It even goes through what types of equipment to use, what is the standardization, what error we need to be aware of for different types of equipment. That's really important. It also, the biggest piece is it gives you landmarks, very specific landmarks of where you're going to be assessing. And that way it's more repeatable. So as an athlete grows or shrinks or their body composition changes, we can actually make sure that we're measuring the same spot. Like if you were to measure someone right now and then 5 minutes later, measure them in the same spot on the tricep, how do we really know it's the same spot? So it helps reduce that error by ensuring that precision. And this kinanthropometry is really, people are like, what exactly does that mean? That's really the interface between anatomy and movement, or thinking about our structure is going to determine the function. So when it comes to physics and biomechanics, it plays a big role on, what potential there is with someone's structure. So speaking of structure, one of the things that we measure is bone structure through their breadths and lengths. We do more of this in level 2, and we do a modified version in level 1, but we have a lot of information about genetic components. Ones we can't change, like our bone structure, and the ones that we can change, the muscle and our fat, which we measure through our skin folds. The muscles measured using circumferences, and we can even measure changes through, for example, changes in abdominal girths. The measurement of a skeleton can't really be changed much, assuming that someone isn't growing anymore. That's going to be pretty set. But the muscle and function can be changed with diet and training. So the bone structure is really a very important when it comes to sport, because it is pretty set once you're an adult. And this does play a big role on how much muscle we can hold, and really has a lot to do with our performance and our health, that muscle and fat amounts. So again, thinking about structure, function, anatomy, and physiology, that is really what we're thinking about when it comes to the different information in genes, because this is the cards we've been dealt. This is what we've been given. And so how can we best help our athletes meet their maximal performance through what they've been given? And again, the soft tissue measures, we do that in level 1 and level 2. Girths, looking at muscle, and skin folds reflecting the adipose. The level 1 is more condensed, and the level 2 is more comprehensive. Okay, so why do we use this? What exactly is it used for? There's a lot of things that Isac can be used for. First, it's great for assessing growth. We will talk a little bit more about that, but one of the things that's really unique about it is you can determine different levels of maturity. There are different levels of maturity. People will look at bone age, they'll look at sexual maturity, and you can also use anthropometry. Obviously, we don't always have access to maybe an X-ray to get someone's exact age based on their wrist measurements, but through different assessments of some of their basic measurements, we can really look at hormones, not hormones. We can look at the impact that is being had on growth. Different hormones are released after maturity, and this increase in testosterone is about 6 months after peak height velocity, and after peak height velocity has occurred in males. Bone growth after peak height velocity is also going to decrease. It's going to solidify, reducing risk for fractures, becoming more stable, and less, make it more, we're forming the final structure. But what's interesting is that as we get older, so with assessing growth, first we can assess, how much longer do they have to grow, estimate, what part of the growth cycle are they in. And then once we get there, we can have a much more customized weight through muscle to bone ratio. It's also a standardized approach, as I've reiterated. It's portable, and we can use it for statistics using a technical error measurement and database. So diving in a little bit more, one of the things that's most fascinating, I was blown away by the impact that we could really have on a player, and their really working as part of the team to change their habits, and giving them a why behind it. It really helps target, are we focusing on hypertrophy? Are we focusing on fat loss? Or are we just trying to stay the same? What are we really aiming for? But basically, muscle to bone ratio relates to the ratio between how much muscle someone has and the bone size at that location. So the larger the bone breadth, the more potential muscle the bone can hold. So unfortunately, we have limited reference data per sport, but we do know that each sport has its own individual ideals based on the function of what is done in each sport. So muscle bone ratios really address level 2 Isac certification, and it really is, to me, one of the most fascinating pieces of Isac. So how can this be used? Well, as I started alluding to, possibly even in scouting to get started with the growth assessment. So a lot of times we might be interested in signing someone who's a lot younger, trying to identify, are they done growing? Are they at their peak height velocity? Have they passed it years ago? Or, do we still have a few years left? I had someone who was about 17, 18 years old, and he was around 5'2". By the time he was 19, he was already 5'11". By the time he was 20, he was going into 6'1". He just had this huge growth spurt. He was just a very late bloomer, but that is an example of possibly missing someone's, thinking that maybe they're completed their growth and maybe not ideal for that sport. Example would be basketball, where we know height to some degree does play a role in what's considered elite versus the rest of the population. So looking at, what types of a database we could build, what are we looking for when we're scouting? Are there certain bone structures even that we could be considering? Which, this is a very controversial topic in certain countries. The idea of encouraging a certain sport selection based on genetic potential isn't really can be frowned upon, and it's very controversial. So we have to also be careful to make sure we're using it smart, and also to help the athletes, not ever as a way to hurt. We use it for a long-term. We can use it for long-term athlete development. Looking for with that in those. In the Dominican, some of the other groups that have a much more developmental league, we can really figure out, is he done growing? How much taller? That sort of thing, as I mentioned. And obviously nutrition can play a big role in that individualized approach to assessing body weight. How much muscle can your frame hold? And this leads us to strength and conditioning. Athletic training and physical therapy, even different sports medicine groups. So we really want to know someone's ideal body weight. How much muscle can they hold? Not just estimated of the equations that we got in school, but what is their bone structure really capable of? If a bone structure has too much muscle in an area, it's more likely to get injured on that. And we want to be sure that we are minimizing injury, always trying to make sure that, an athlete is able to stay on the field longer. So from this, once we have an ideal body weight in mind, we can talk with strength and conditioning to look at workout types. Are we doing hypertrophy on a body part that we might want to limit? Maybe the athletic training and physical therapy have identified some high injury risks at a certain point. Maybe we should limit those different hypertrophy works due to strains or joint size. Maybe we should be doing more power for certain types of movements. Again, what about when they're growing? What phase are they in during that peak height velocity curve? If they are in the developmental leagues or still growing, and how do we change their, this is where strength plays such a big role in making any modifications for their training program based on what part of that individual cycle they're at for growth. Because you might have someone who's really tall and you think that they're done growing, but they might just be starting and their final stature is going to be much, much taller. And obviously this will impact different parts of development, including things like balance, strength. Those are impacted depending on what part of that cycle we're at. And just reiterating, our goal is to help them maximize their performance, be their best version of themselves, keep them on the field. We certainly don't want them getting injured. And I think that this customized approach to ideal body weight, customizing, looking really at someone's growth potential, where are they at, and then the muscle bone ratio can be really huge on providing that really comprehensive care. And then this is one of my favorite concepts, is that when we have the same old thinking, we get the same old results. And when we've had a history of having a lot of things done by tradition, it might be harder for a topic that is science-based to come in, especially when we don't have a database on it. So a big topic for us is really making sure that we have references to what's considered elite for that sport, what's considered, the best, the top 1% ever for those that have been, the Hall of Famers for each position. So each position can have different structures that are more fitted for that, or sorry, not more fitted. Yeah, more fitted, that lend a little bit better towards that role. But identifying what are those, if there are any, what are they, and how can we maximize those measurements? So, again, we're given our genetic, we're given our cards, we're given our deck, and then how do we make the best hand with it that we can for each different position. Now, baseball's not as internationally renowned as some of the other sports. We have lots of data on swimming and soccer, and baseball is one that we were a little, we could use to get ahead and catch back up with some of the other sports where they have really specific bone structures that they know that, when there's a ratio of this to this, they're 70% more likely to perform in this level. And again, it doesn't, this isn't looking at the other factors that we know are so critical, and who's really elite from the rest, but this is just one piece of the genetic part. And then another feature is of this unique methodology is that it determines the level of test or error by taking multiple measurements at each site and landmark. There has always been human error with body composition. That's why we don't use calipers if we have the choice not to, in a lot of cases. But really making sure we have repeated measures with the right technique is going to reduce that amount of error. Also, if we know what the percent error is, it can be used as a reference to determine if a significant change has occurred. Have they made significant changes on their body composition? Is it within that standard of error that we would expect? Being able to look at that standardized approach really helps to improve the outcomes of our interventions too. So if we know that a change has or hasn't occurred, we can take a different approach to what nutrition, strength, athletic training, what interventions we've made to try and make those body changes. So a lot of times when people are thinking about, measuring body composition, obviously things like DEXA and BOD-POD are really great inter and intra users. So it doesn't matter who you are, they are very repeatable. But one of the challenges with DEXA, for example, is that even if it's the same brand and the exact same model, a DEXA at one location is not going to measure exactly, it's not going to be apples to apples as a DEXA at another location. And that's because they're the way that they're calibrated. This allows us to talk more in apples to apples. And also when thinking about proportionality, we look at someone and we're like, wow, he has really large hands, but he's already 6'5". Are his hands really large? Or are they proportionally actually the same size? So that helps us using statistics and databases and the understanding of the different measurements and their relationship with biomechanics allows us to identify which of these parts are playing a big role. Are his hands really large and we need large hands for that role? Does a shortstop need larger hands? Do we need from the floor to shoulder, does that need to be higher for a pitcher, or is it total stature height that matters, or do none of them matter? Is it really just the angle from this to that? You know, what are the variables, if any, that are playing a role for each position to help us best maximize performance at each one, and particularly looking at what can we do to make those changes, especially when we think about, you know, the difficulty that we have going from one country to another. We can't travel with a dex, we can't travel with a bod pod. So these percentages do allow us to refer back to z-scores, bring everyone back to apples, and also really think about what's the best, you know, what's important for an elite baseball player, what's important for the best of the elites, and then what's just not really important, so that we can narrow our testing. Another key point is around, you know, what does a data point mean? What I mean by that is we need a reference database for comparing any conclusion to what is the norms. So any variable to those norms is what I mean. And if I had a body fat percentage of 19%, is that good? Is that bad? Well, if it's a certain position, it might be too high fat. If it's the lineman, it's probably too low fat, or is it right on the money? In some places, I know, for example, the linemen's were 25 to 28 in body fat from a DEXA study, which is that good, or is that pretty normal? Or if I have someone at 19, is that too, you know, are they going to be higher risk for injury because of what their body's exposed to? So again, each position, if for baseball, for different sports, is going to help us with that. And there is not a published reference database for all the different positions and what's considered elite for baseball yet. And then just thinking about a sample, again, our goal really is to help with maximizing our athletes and our players' ability to perform and to stay on the field. So, for example, if someone's hips are overloaded, what options do we have to increase power if they're a pitcher? If the hips have more room to add mass, can we build more muscle to add more power? You know, there's a lot of different questions that we can ask. And when we get all the different minds in the same room, it can help us to think a little outside the box in order for us to really maximize that player's experience and their performance. So just for example, I worked with one that when I do this assessment, sometimes I might just be pulled in to just do the assessment, and I don't know anything about the individual. But on assessment, found that there was a big discrepancy. He had really small knees and very small hips for his height, and there was a big discrepancy between that bone size and the amount of muscle he was carrying at that location. When I explained what we were seeing and what the risk could be, what could start presenting. If continued down that road, some of the other staff were surprised. They were like, "Oh wow, he has that history of injuries to that low back. He has lots of frequent back pain and frequent hamstring pulls when you look at his medical record. And he's always wanting to do hard, heavy leg workouts because he thinks his legs are small." But once we educated, intervention being education to the player on what his structure is and the risks of the injury part, we were able to manage his expectations, realign them so that he would have less hypertrophy based around that area, and strength worked with him to adjust them. PT worked with them to maximize, reduce the risk of injury in that area through other compensation techniques, and really just focusing on injury prevention at that spot. And then different positions, when you think about what are the performance variables that we want in a player, that's where when you get from strength and conditioning, physical therapy, the coaches, the scouts all involved, just becomes a huge game changer for how can we make the best program for this individual, to really have the best longevity, everyone having a win. So that's just an example of how it can be used in sport, and with the different database concepts as well, those statistics, and then applying it. So, there are a lot of people have asked, like, what are the steps for Isac? Basically, there's level 1, level 2 classes. Level 1 is basic measurements, including skin folds. Level 2 includes muscle to bone ratio, a little bit more in depth on growth, and also that bone structure analysis. I didn't talk about this much, but somatotyping is also included in these. So that's another piece that can be used for the individual position assessment as well. And level 1, once for both of these are really more the process, learning the standardized process. So in both cases, you'll review, once you've done level 1, you do 20 measurements of people, and then resubmit them to get certified. 6 months after you've completed all your certification requirements, completing the course, doing the 20 profiles, then you move to the level 2. You can move to level 2 class, which is where they do the more in-depth comprehensive assessment. A lot of the stuff in level 1 that is on bone structure is more predictive, whereas level 2 is actual measured. So when you pair these with the DEXA, it becomes quite a powerful assessment process. So with that in mind, again, this is just an overview of Isac and how it can be used. You'll be seeing it at MLB Combine again this year. And if you are interested in asking any questions, or if you have want to get certified, please feel free to reach out to me. I do provide CEUs and basic equipment, as well as an applied practitioner approach for how to measure in an org, or different questions on, how do we roll this out? Where do we start? Or, really taking a step back and looking at what's the best that we can do in our org to, how can we utilize it? Maybe it's just a small way to just focus on these 5-10 guys that are frequently injured, or, identifying it from that perspective. So without further ado, I will turn it back over to our group with Matt. And have a lovely rest of the day. And thank you so much for your time today.